So it's my pleasure to introduce Commissioner McSweeny, who's our next keynote speaker. Her bio is in the book as well, so I'm not going to go and reread that. But I would like to point out a few things that are not in her bio. The first, going back, starting from her time when she was the advisor to Senator Biden and then the advisor to Vice President Biden, she worked very deeply on internet issues, including with Michael and I when we were at the NSC. And then when she went to the Justice Department, I think very importantly, really spearheaded the work on the DOJ and FTC antitrust policy statement on sharing of cyber threat information, which was key before CISA to the ability for a lot of different ISACs and ISOs to start up. I've heard specifically from the auto ISAC and from the retail ISAC, the RCISC, the retail ISAC, that they would not have been able to move forward had it not been for that statement. So she knows information sharing as well, following up on the last speaker. And I will also say that she's one of the best colleagues I've ever had to work with when she was at when we were at the White House together. And I was so thrilled when she was named as a commissioner. When Vice President Biden, it says that she was. I was looking at in the bio. It actually says the date that you were made a commissioner, and I was there. I was in the Indian Treaty Room when Vice President Biden at the time swore her in, and basically brought the room to tears with her talking about her dedication to public service, which was well deserved at the time, and has become even more so well deserved in her role as commissioner at the FTC, where she has stood up for consumers and worked with businesses closely, including on issues around cybersecurity. So with that, I'll pass it on to Terrell. Thanks.
What an incredibly nice introduction. Thank you so much. All right, you're a great colleague too, by the way. Like two-way street on that. And in DC, you don't always find that, so it's really refreshing when you do. But I have to say, I think we were extremely lucky in all of our colleagues in the Obama administration, especially. We had really good people to work with on these important issues. So I wanted to just start by saying thank you so much for having me here to chat with you about cybersecurity and policy and law. And I want to start also by just saying thank you to everybody in the room who's doing such terrific work in this space. So many of you are friends, colleagues, thought leaders in this space, have been trying for a very long time to improve what we're doing around consumer data security, that I think it's terrific to join you in the conversation. And I certainly feel like everybody in the room is a big expert. So I forgive me if I tell you a bunch of things you already know about the Federal Trade Commission, but I also want to make sure we have a little bit of time for questions. I'm not going to give you the official FTC views today because I don't know, they're just not that interesting anymore to me. I'll give you my individual views as an individual commissioner and not the official FTC stuff. Although a lot of what I'm going to talk about are things that the FTC has been saying for a very long time and that people in the room have been saying for a very long time. And so I think maybe the other thing we all share in common is a little bit of frustration when it comes to the current state of affairs. So you'll forgive me if I vent a little bit in my remarks today. So the FTC, as everybody is no doubt aware, is the Federal Trade Commission. We do nothing associated with actual trade policy, so that's confusing. But we do protect consumers and competition in the American marketplace. And part of our consumer protection mission has inevitably led us to protecting consumers in the online world, both their privacy and their data security. We do that primarily by using our authority to protect consumers from unfair, deceptive acts and practices. And so in the data security realm, the unfair, deceptive acts and practices typically involve either unreasonable security process and practice, resulting very often in breach, or overly ambitious marketing statements made about the level of security around products, and some of these statements can be regarded as deceptive. I became a commissioner a little more than 3 years ago, as Ari was just saying, and thanks for being there that day. That was a pretty special day. And at that time, which I guess it feels like a lifetime ago in cybersecurity, there were frequent stories about malware, data breaches, and loss of consumer privacy. The FTC at the time was calling on Congress to pass stronger comprehensive data security legislation. We were studying the new and difficult threats posed by IoT products, such as IoT-facilitated DDoS attacks, safety issues, malware, ransomware. And that year, as in many of the recent past years, our top consumer complaints related to identity theft. Even then, though, it was actually hard to imagine that a repository of data like Equifax would be breached with the loss of 150 million consumer records. So that was even hard to imagine at that point. And I wish I could say that 3 years later, the situation was different, that we'd passed stronger laws, codifying reasonable security standards, addressed critical vulnerabilities, and improved the remediation process for consumers around identity theft. But I think in fairness, you'd have to say our progress is decidedly a mixed bag, and that's not for lack of trying, by the way. On the positive side of the ledger, and I think we all should get some credit for some of the really excellent work that has been done in the area around information sharing, around making sure that we are putting in place stronger practices in the marketplace and improving remediation. There's also been a sea change, I think, of public awareness and business culture towards security. So I regard that as a real positive. The typical American consumer is more concerned about their security and privacy than they were even 3 years ago. A recent Pew poll found that 84% of American consumers take steps to protect their privacy and security online. The poll found that the steps consumers are taking are not just using an anonymous ID on a social media page or something like that, but rather Americans are increasingly adopting VPNs, encryption, do not track browsers, and are routinely clearing cookies and web histories. Essentially, Americans are seeking out technical means to take their security and privacy into their own hands and are now incorporating that into their daily lives. Within companies, there has been a cultural shift as well. Where cybersecurity and privacy was once relegated to isolated departments, corporations are integrating these functions into C-suite decision-making. Gartner, the international business advisory firm, has pegged corporate cyber spending last year at over $70 billion and expects that the number will grow to more than $113 billion in 2020. Corporate America is also embracing ideas that once seemed not only unorthodox, but also some saw as even illegal. The clearest example of this is the proliferation of vulnerability disclosure programs. After years of existing on the fringes, creating partnerships with ethical security researchers to test new software, products, and services is quickly becoming a best practice. For instance, the first draft of the reauthorization of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration Act a couple of years ago contained language that was going to make it illegal to perform security research on automotive software. Thankfully, a number of us, even in this room, weighed in on that, and the language was removed. And now the automotive industry, the OEMs, have embraced the security of the research community, the security research community, and companies like GM and Ford have robust vulnerability disclosure programs. The industry itself is taking steps through the formation of its ISAC to engage in information sharing, all of which I regard as extremely positive response to the high-profile hacking that took place of the Jeeps and other vehicles in 2014. The FTC has also upped its outreach to consumers and businesses. With the exception of last year, identity theft has been the highest consumer complaint that we receive at the FTC year over year for the past decade. 2 years ago, at the direction of President Obama, the FTC began the process of renovating and recreating the resources available to consumers on identitytheft.gov. This website the clearinghouse essentially for consumers who are facing issues associated with a breach or needing to remediate the consequences of one through restoring their identity security. So we're trying to ensure that it is a one-stop shop that is as seamless as possible for consumers to reduce the time and costs associated with identity theft. The one thing we haven't yet been able to accomplish, which I really hope we can continue to work on, is having the website also be a one-stop shop for consumers who want to put a freeze on their credit or put a fraud alert for all three credit reporting agencies in one place. And we're continuing to work with the CRAs. We need their help on that. With the events of the last few weeks and the American public's consciousness, I think it's high time that they step up and help us with that process. Because resolving identity theft is complicated, and the fallout from the Equifax breach has demonstrated just how cumbersome remediation is for the average consumer. It is a stream of confusing terms. Should you get a freeze or an alert? And confusing products. Should you sign up for a lock or should you enroll in credit monitoring? Once a consumer has decoded these options, they must deal with each CRA individually. And this process needs to be easier, and I believe it is incumbent on the CRAs to work with us to make it so. The FTC has also long advocated security by design, concept that is incredibly familiar to everybody in the room. This means including security in the development of a product or service in addition to developing a culture of security within a business's operations. We have put out guides and done roadshows to teach businesses what we mean by security by design. And our Start with Security framework, which we put out a couple of years ago, workshopped around the country, has been followed by our Stick with Security framework, which is a program designed to provide businesses with an understanding of how to establish a culture of security and what reasonable security posture looks like. We're committed to constantly updating these important business education materials based not just on the cases that the FTC is bringing around unreasonable data security practices, but also based on the best practices that the FTC sees in the industry. Now, I think it's important to remember that the standard we are using here when we think about liability is reasonableness. It is, I think, a flexible standard. It is one that can keep pace with a very dynamic and highly innovative sector, which is what the cybersecurity sector needs to be. You know, I think none of us would contest the fact that state-of-the-art security in 2005 looks very different than what is adequate and reasonable security in 2017. And to their credit, I think businesses and consumers are investing more in securing their data. So I view this as a very hopeful moment in which we have been partnering quite successfully for a number of years in making sure that we are putting forward best practices and getting those out into the marketplace. The FTC is also using our convening power to conduct research and work across stakeholder groups to understand the ever-changing security landscape. We've engaged the academic community with our annual PrivacyCon, where academics and researchers present papers on security and privacy and economics annually, and we'll be doing that again in 2018. And we've also used our own authorities to conduct research. Later this year, the Commission will be issuing a report on security update practices for mobile devices based on information that the Commission has collected from all 8 mobile device manufacturers. This report will build on the Commission's prior work regarding mobile security updates for mobile devices, including its consent order with the mobile device manufacturer HTC America that required the company to patch vulnerable devices and provide consumers with clear and prominent patching and notice instructions. These are all positives, but as I mentioned before, increasing connectivity, new threats, and new breaches are creating new concerns for the American consumer. The Internet of Things, the ecosystem of devices we are buying and connecting to facilitate our on-demand lifestyle, has morphed into the Internet of Everything, including even now one of my favorite newer terms, the Internet of Bodies. So I think we can we maybe park all of these analogies at a certain point, but they point to the fact that we are connecting more and more things on our bodies and in our homes and in our cars at an incredibly rapid pace. And we can no longer consider the technology in our lives to be isolated from the other areas of life. The internet is always on, it's always present, and it connects all of us nearly every waking moment of the day. Every consumer is a technology user, and every business is a technology company. The emergent universality has bred new threats to consumer well-being. More than 2 years ago, the FTC identified the vast threat insecure IoT posed, saying it could be harnessed for botnets. We followed on that guidance by bringing enforcement actions involving insecure IoT, including routers, and running a contest even, the IoT Home Inspector Challenge, to provide consumers with better ways to secure their insecure home IT. But we can't contain that threat alone. Urgent action is required. I mean, I can't believe it was just last fall we had the Mirai botnet took down chunks of the entire internet, and today Reaper is infecting millions of cameras and routers. Reaper, by the way, I read a report, was being described as a cyber hurricane. So I want to start running a contest for better analogies that can translate out into the American public the urgency of the situation. Cyber hurricane is a good one. But be thinking of others. We'll need them. Ransomware is also an ever-growing problem. In the last 6 months, we've seen hospitals and utilities shut down due to ransomware attacks. I believe that the next few years we will find an increasing number of assaults aimed at consumer products. Connected appliances, connected cars, connected wearables are all vectors for attacks. And consumers who find a smart television or connected car suddenly rendered inoperable due to ransomware will be extorted to pay in order to regain the function of the product. Unfortunately, policymakers and law enforcement still don't have clear guidance for consumers on what to do in that situation. We've held a workshop on it, but it's really challenging. I'd love to advise people not to pay ransoms, but if your car won't start, is that really practical? And how are companies going to manage these risks to their consumer products, I think will be incredibly important, not only as supply chains grow increasingly complicated, but also as security becomes more complicated. We need to be able to provide end users answers with what to do in that kind of situation and who they should call. So one of the thought experiments I like to run is imagine your parents' smart TV is a victim of a ransomware attack and they call you first. What do you tell them to do? So I think this is an area that we all need to be very focused on. And it's one of the reasons why the FTC has taken a more active role towards the security of internet-connected devices, and why I'm concerned about recent debates among policymakers about the so-called reach of our unfairness authority. The FTC's Section 5 gives us authority to police against unfair or deceptive acts and practices. For the FTC to find an injury happened because of unfairness, we use a 3-part test. First, we ask, is the injury substantial? Next, we examine if it is outweighed by a benefit to consumers or competition. And finally, we have to determine whether it could have been reasonably avoidable. In my estimation, the use of the unfairness authority to guard consumer cybersecurity is a fundamental charge of the FTC, especially when there are no other consumer protection agencies with a broad mandate to protect consumer data security. While consumers understand the basics of protecting their data, when companies use insecure software or fail to encrypt consumer data or carelessly warehouse customer information or fail to adopt reasonable cybersecurity practices, they are being unfair to their customers. And if a breach were to happen, while not every customer will be compromised, the mere fact that some will provides enough nexus to harm to not be outweighed by any benefit of having lax security or bad cyber hygiene. Unfortunately, some policymakers see this issue very differently. To them, cybersecurity is a series of mutually exclusive decisions made in individual silos, rather than an interconnected world of free-flowing data where the weakest link can cause immense harm. They see a world where the FTC must provide and ascertain a link to every specific injury from a specific breach. Doing this is, I think, as most people in the room would appreciate, particularly challenging given both the amount of data that has already been breached and the interconnectedness of all of the ecosystem. The best policy is to make sure the weakest link in the network is strengthened and that irresponsible or lax security practices are policed by the Federal Trade Commission. While this debate is interesting, it doesn't really matter to the millions of American consumers who are trying to protect themselves from the fallout of recent breaches. And as many of you know, the FTC announced we are investigating following the Equifax breach, both that breach and as are numerous other government agencies. While this breach comes 2 years after 2015, which, by the way, at the time was called the year of the breach, it is really one of the largest breaches we've experienced in recent history. So you can imagine that although the FTC has called on Congress to pass comprehensive data breach and privacy legislation for a number of years, we are continuing to reiterate our call to Congress to take action for more comprehensive cybersecurity legislation. We need more and better tools to ensure compliance and strengthen the weak links in our interconnected, data-driven economy. We need civil penalty authority so that our investigations that find fault can result in fines, not just conduct agreements. We need to protect our unfairness authority and, if necessary, give the FTC rulemaking authority as well. So I'm concerned that after each cyber disaster or cyber hurricane or whatever analogy we're going to use, we're going to be met with more gridlock and indecision from Congress. That the various daily outrages will subsume the continued vulnerability of all of our data. That rather than enacting solutions, data security and privacy will become, like a lot of other issues, met and with shrugged shoulders and by resignation. So I hope that's not the case, and that's why I'm thrilled that you all are here today and that we're having this conversation, because I think the only way we can continue to move the ball forward and rebuild some of the consumer trust that has been lost in this technology is by meaningfully working together to address both the security practices that we know are the right ones, lift them up and move them forward, and continue pressure on policymakers to provide the right incentives in the marketplace to move our cybersecurity forward in this incredibly important moment. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions, if we have time. Oh, I have the mics. Can I throw them out in the audience? No, they're heavy.
Hello. Yeah, there. Bottom's the antenna. That's what he was doing. Okay. Questions? Mr. Wanger.
Thank you for joining us today. We heard some of the in the prior panel discussing IoT. There was a reference to the D-Link case. Mm-hmm. I know this is the case is in a little bit of a flux right now. But just curious if there's anything you could say about the complaint and the status of the case.
So D-Link is our case involving routers and insecure routers. As I've just said, insecure routers and IoT is a threat that we have been talking about at the FTC for some time. When I first started talking about the possibility of insecure IoT being used in botnets and harnessed for attacks, people thought I was being alarmist. That was 2 years ago. I don't think anybody thinks that anymore. But we are still, our use of this authority in this space is still sort of actively in litigation, which is why I think it might be very helpful ultimately to clarify the FTC's authority so that we are not on the defensive when we're trying to bring cases involving very unreasonable security practices, especially around IoT, IOB, IOE, whatever we're talking about.
Tom Gann with McAfee. Very nice talk. So the question I've got deals with the matter of the Social Security number, the significant breach of security numbers that now really have very little confidence. What's your view relative to the political mood, the policy environment for actually making a move towards a digital identity that can be a backstop, that can buttress the social security number, indeed possibly replace it?
Yeah. All right. Well, I think this is a great question. I think it would be a lot easier for Congress to pass comprehensive data security legislation that gave the FTC civil penalty authority, but somehow that hasn't happened in 5 years. So I think we have to be a bit realistic about whether we can really move towards a system that is like one you describe. That said, I think there's a tremendous amount of benefit in laying the policy foundation and making the case for why that could be useful. So I support the dialogue around this question. I think it's the right set of questions to be talking about. In the interim, though, we really have to step up how we're handling the security of consumers. And so the biggest fear that I have is a sort of general apathy that tends to take over the conversation, something like, well, everything has already been breached anyway, and so why should we even try to do anything about it? And you probably, all of us in the room have probably encountered this conversation in some form, and I think that that's a particularly problematic posture. So I'm all for dialogue around ideas here and changes that we should be making. It's for sure a big challenge for consumers, and I think we can have a reasonable policy conversation around how we're handling not just the security of consumer data, but also potentially the rights around it, such as portability of data and some of those aspects as well.
Hi, Commissioner. I'm Harley Geiger with Rapid7. Thank you very much for being here and for your service, particularly on this issue, on cybersecurity. You talked about a comprehensive cybersecurity legislation. Just wondering if you could outline in broad strokes what you think that legislation ought to look like today. And from your perspective, why has it failed so far? Why hasn't anything been done?
Well, there are probably more people in the room that can answer that question. The failure part of it, at least from firsthand experience, more clearly than I might be able to. I think it is hard, and I understand why it's hard. But when I talk about comprehensive data security legislation, and this won't surprise anyone, I'm a Democrat, so I can say things like regulation and believe that that's not a bad idea. But here, let me make a case for it for just a second. So all of us know that in fact the cybersecurity regulatory frameworks that are in the U.S. economy are a kind of a patchwork. There is a safeguards rule, there is a HIPAA rule, there is a COPPA rule. I think there's a FERPA requirement. Then there's 47 different state laws around breach and notification, right? So we know that there are actually a number of different legal requirements already on the books around issues of both what the security, like actual rules about what your security practice needs to be and your requirements are. Oh, telecommunications, I forgot about that one. And also about what your requirements are when it comes to how to handle notice of breach to consumers. So I think a comprehensive rule or data security law would give the FTC rulemaking approach for sectors that doesn't already have authority over. It would include penalty authority because I think a bigger stick and more liability would be helpful in creating more incentives to do the right thing around cybersecurity in the marketplace. And it would address, I think, harmonizing breach notification and what we're doing there. I don't and the counter argument is generally like, well, it's such a dynamic space. How can you possibly write a rule? It's too scary. And this is what I actually don't think is true about this at all. Of course, there are already rules on the books. The NIST critical infrastructure framework is the same thing as the Start with Security framework that the FTC is using. These are all harmonized with the current rules that are already on the books for certain industries. They all are process-based, tech-neutral, generally about how to do reasonable security practice. And they would need to be updated regularly, but I don't think that what they would say is unknown or even unachievable. So that's what I'd say. And I mean, I think we need to continue the conversation that you guys are on the cutting edge of around vulnerability disclosure programs, how we do that. We need to have a broader policy conversation so that we are getting the balance right when it comes to facilitating research and how the government works with the white hat researcher community as well.
Any last question? Commissioner, thank you so much for
coming. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.